Hello, everyone. I'm here to help you drift off to sleep tonight. Before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy what we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It always amazes me to see our global community coming together for these quiet moments. Now, get comfortable, adjust your pillows, maybe pull that blanket a little higher, and let the gentle rain sounds wash over you as we begin tonight's collection of true stories. The notification appeared on my phone at exactly 3:47 in the morning. A simple text from an unknown number that read, "Your order is ready for pickup." I stared at the glowing screen in confusion, my mind still foggy from sleep. I hadn't ordered anything. The message included an address I didn't recognize on the outskirts of town, along with instructions to come alone and bring exact change. My first instinct was to delete the message and go back to sleep. Wrong numbers happened all the time, and whatever mix-up this was would sort itself out in the morning. But something about the message nagged at me. The timestamp showed it had been sent exactly at 3:47, but when I checked the delivery time, it said I had until 4:30 to collect my order, or it would be given to someone else. I found myself getting dressed without really deciding to do it. The address was only 20 minutes away, and curiosity had always been my weakness. Besides, I was wide awake now anyway. I grabbed my keys and headed out into the humid summer night. The GPS led me through increasingly unfamiliar neighborhoods, until I found myself on a narrow street lined with industrial buildings and empty lots. The address corresponded to a small storefront squeezed between a closed auto repair shop and what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. The building was dark except for a single light in the window, and a handwritten sign on the door read, "Night Pickup Only." I sat in my car for a moment, engine running, debating whether this was worth pursuing. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was obviously some kind of scam or worse. But the building looked legitimate enough, and there was something almost mundane about the whole setup that made it feel less threatening than it probably should have. I approached the door and knocked softly. After a moment, I heard footsteps from inside, and the door opened to reveal an elderly man wearing a stained apron. His face was deeply lined, and his eyes held the tired quality of someone who had been working long past their usual bedtime. "You must be here for the 3:47 order," he said, not bothering to check any identification or confirm my name. Come in, come in. We don't like to keep customers waiting." The interior of the shop was cramped and dimly lit, filled with shelves that held an assortment of items I couldn't quite identify in the poor lighting. There was a strong smell in the air, not unpleasant but unfamiliar, like herbs mixed with something metallic. "What exactly did I order?" I asked, following the man toward a counter at the back of the store. He paused and looked at me with an expression that seemed almost pitying. "You don't remember? That's unfortunate, but not uncommon. The process can be disorienting for first-time customers." He reached under the counter and produced a small wooden box, roughly the size of a jewelry case. The wood was dark and smooth, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. "This is what you requested," he said, setting the box on the counter between us. "Payment is due upon pickup, as specified in your original inquiry." I stared at the box, trying to make sense of what was happening. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake. I never ordered anything from this store. I don't even know what this place is." The old man's expression didn't change. The mind often protects itself from memories that are too difficult to process. It's a natural defense mechanism, but the contract was signed, and the work has been completed. Payment is required. "How much?" I heard myself asking, though I couldn't explain why I was playing along with this obvious case of mistaken identity. $57.33. Exact change only, as specified. I checked my wallet and was surprised to find exactly $57.33. Not close to that amount, but precisely that sum, down to the penny. The coincidence sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning humming in the background. "What's in the box?" I asked, my hand hovering over the money. "What you asked for," he replied. "What you needed. What you were willing to pay for when you made your initial contact." The whole situation felt like a dream, but the money in my hands was real, and the man's patient expression suggested he was prepared to wait as long as necessary for me to make my decision. Against every instinct I possessed, I counted out the exact amount and placed it on the counter. The old man swept the bills into a drawer with practiced efficiency and pushed the wooden box toward me. "A word of advice," he said as I picked up the box. "Don't open it until you're ready to accept what's inside. Some things can't be undone once they've been acknowledged." I left the store with more questions than answers, the wooden box feeling heavier than its size should have warranted. The drive home passed in a blur, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror repeatedly, though I couldn't say what I was looking for. Back in my apartment, I set the box on my kitchen table and stared at it for nearly an hour. The patterns carved into its surface seemed more pronounced under my overhead light, forming designs that reminded me of maps or maybe architectural drawings. There was no visible latch or lock, but when I tried to lift the lid, it remained firmly sealed. I tried everything I could think of, pressing different sections of the carved patterns, rotating parts of the box, even attempting to pry it open with a kitchen knife. Nothing worked. The box remained stubbornly closed, as if waiting for some specific condition to be met. It wasn't until I was getting ready for bed that I noticed the change in my reflection. At first, I thought it was just the poor lighting in my bathroom, but when I looked more carefully, I could see that something was different about my eyes. They seemed darker somehow, more shadowed, as if I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. I splashed cold water on my face and looked again. This time, the change was more pronounced. My skin looked paler, almost gray in the fluorescent light, and there were lines around my eyes that I was certain hadn't been there that morning. I rushed back to the kitchen and grabbed the wooden box. As I approached the bathroom mirror, carrying the box with me, I could swear I felt it grow warmer in my hands. When I held it up to my reflection, the lid clicked open with a soft sound like a sigh. Inside was a single photograph, old and slightly faded. It showed a young woman standing in front of what appeared to be the same storefront I had visited earlier that evening. The woman in the photo looked exactly like me, but the clothes she wore and the style of the photograph suggested it had been taken decades ago. Written on the back of the photograph in faded ink was a date from 30 years before I was born, along with a message that made my blood run cold. Payment received. Contract fulfilled. Welcome to the family business. I looked up at my reflection and saw that my appearance had changed even more dramatically. The face staring back at me from the mirror belonged to the woman in the photograph, aged by the same 30 years that separated the date on the back from the present moment. My phone buzzed with another text message. This time it was from my own number, sent to someone I didn't recognize. The message read, "Your order is ready for pickup. Come alone and bring exact change." I realized with growing horror that I was no longer the customer in this transaction. Somehow, without understanding how or when it had happened, I had become part of the store's operation. The box in my hands felt like it was burning now, but when I tried to set it down, my fingers wouldn't obey. The bathroom lights flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, I saw other reflections in the mirror. Dozens of faces, all similar to mine, all wearing the same expression of confused terror that I could feel on my own features. They were all holding identical wooden boxes, all staring out from what I now understood was not a reflection at all, but a window into somewhere else entirely. The lights stabilized, and I was alone again. But the knowledge remained. I had become part of something much larger and older than I had imagined possible. The late-night pickup had not been a mistake or a case of mistaken identity. It had been an invitation, and by accepting it, I had accepted responsibilities that I was only beginning to understand. My phone continued to buzz with messages throughout the night. Orders coming in from numbers I didn't recognize. People who would soon find themselves standing in that small storefront, just as confused and curious as I had been. People who would make the same choice I had made, driven by the same inexplicable compulsion to see things through to their conclusion. The wooden box remained open in my hands, the photograph inside serving as both explanation and warning. I understood now that I would be the one greeting the next customer, wearing that same stained apron, offering that same patient smile. The cycle would continue, as it had apparently continued for decades, each participant believing they were making their own choice while actually fulfilling obligations they had somehow agreed to long before they realized what was happening. As dawn approached, I found myself getting dressed for work, though I couldn't remember making the decision to do so. The wooden box had closed itself again, and when I tried to leave it behind, my feet simply wouldn't carry me toward the door. It seemed I had an appointment to keep, and customers who would be depending on me to fulfill their orders, just as someone had fulfilled mine. The last rational thought I managed before leaving my apartment was wondering if any of my predecessors had tried to fight against what was happening to them, or if they had all simply accepted their new role with the same resigned understanding that was settling over me like a comfortable but inescapable blanket. The rain outside was getting heavier, drumming against the windows with a rhythm that seemed almost musical. The drive to the storefront felt different this time, as if the streets themselves were guiding me along a predetermined path. I found myself knowing exactly which turns to make, which shortcuts to take, despite having only visited the place once before in the middle of the night. The wooden box sat on the passenger seat beside me, emanating that same subtle warmth I had felt earlier. When I arrived, the elderly man was waiting for me at the door, but his appearance had changed. He looked younger somehow, his face less lined, his posture straighter. The stained apron he wore seemed cleaner, as if years of accumulated wear had simply melted away overnight. "Right on time," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. "The transition period is always the most difficult part, but you're handling it better than most." Inside the store, everything looked different in the gray morning light filtering through the windows. The shelves I had barely been able to make out in the darkness were now clearly visible, lined with hundreds of wooden boxes identical to the one I carried. Each box bore similar carved patterns, though the designs varied slightly, like fingerprints or signatures. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be both longer and shorter than I expected. He smiled, and I could see in his expression the same resigned understanding that I felt settling over my own thoughts. Time works differently once you become part of the process. I've been here long enough to see the patterns repeat, but not so long that I've forgotten what it felt like to be on the other side of the transaction. He led me behind the counter, where a second apron hung on a hook that I hadn't noticed during my previous visit. The fabric felt familiar in my hands, as if I had worn it countless times before. "The customers will start arriving soon," he explained, checking an old pocket watch that seemed to tick with an irregular rhythm. "They always do, once a new position opens up. The system has its own momentum, its own way of maintaining balance." As if summoned by his words, I heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, I could see a middle-aged man approaching the store, clutching a cell phone and wearing the same expression of confused curiosity that I remembered from my own face in the bathroom mirror. "Your first customer," the elderly man said, already moving toward what appeared to be a back office. "Remember, they're here because they chose to be, even if they don't understand that choice yet. The boxes know where they belong." I tied the apron around my waist and took my position behind the counter. The movements felt natural, practiced, as if muscle memory was guiding me through actions I had never performed before. When the door chimed and the man entered, I found myself greeting him with words that seemed to come from somewhere outside my conscious mind. "You must be here for the 422 order?" I said, noting with detached interest that I somehow knew the exact time his message had been sent. "We don't like to keep customers waiting." The man looked around the dimly lit store with the same mixture of skepticism and fascination that I remembered feeling. "I'm not sure I ordered anything," he said, but his voice carried the same uncertainty that mine had carried, the same willingness to play along despite obvious reservations. I reached under the counter, and my hand found a wooden box that felt slightly different from my own. The patterns carved into its surface were more angular, more geometric, as if designed for someone with a more analytical mind. As I placed it on the counter between us, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, as if I was completing a puzzle that had been missing this particular piece. "Payment is due upon pickup," I heard myself saying. $63.17. Exact change only. The man checked his wallet with the same automatic gesture I had made, and I wasn't surprised when he found precisely the amount required. The system had its own logic, its own way of ensuring that the necessary conditions were met. As he counted out the money, I found myself studying his face, noting the small details that would soon change. The slight crow's feet around his eyes, the way his mouth turned down at the corners, the particular shade of uncertainty in his expression. All of it would be different when he returned, just as everything about me had shifted during my own brief absence from the world I thought I understood. The transaction completed smoothly, with the same ritual warnings about not opening the box until ready, the same patient explanation about the irreversible nature of certain acknowledgments. When he left, carrying his wooden box with the same careful attention I had given to mine, I felt a deep sense of completion, as if I had successfully passed along something precious and dangerous. The elderly man emerged from the back office as the customer's car pulled away. "Well done," he said, and I could hear genuine approval in his voice. "You're adapting to the role more quickly than most. Some people fight against the process for weeks before accepting their new responsibilities." "What happens to the people who fight?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to hear the answer. His expression grew thoughtful. "They eventually understand that fighting against the current only makes the journey more difficult. The destination remains the same regardless of how much energy they spend resisting it." Throughout the morning, more customers arrived, each one carrying that same expression of puzzled determination, each one finding exactly the right amount of money in their wallets, each one leaving with a wooden box that seemed perfectly suited to their particular needs. I served them all with growing confidence, my movements becoming more fluid, my understanding of the process deepening with each transaction. Between customers, I explored the store more thoroughly, discovering rooms and passages that seemed to extend far beyond what the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. Some areas were filled with additional inventory, boxes waiting to be claimed by customers who hadn't yet received their messages. Others contained what appeared to be workspaces, areas where the boxes themselves were crafted and prepared. In one of these workshops, I found evidence of previous employees. Photographs pinned to a bulletin board showed dozens of people wearing the same stained apron, standing behind the same counter, serving customers with the same patient smile. The photos spanned what appeared to be decades, but the faces in them seemed to age and change according to patterns I couldn't quite identify. The business has been operating for a very long time, the elderly man explained when I asked about the photographs. Each generation of workers brings their own perspective to the role, their own understanding of what it means to facilitate these particular transactions. But what is the business actually doing? I pressed. What's really in these boxes? What are we selling? He paused in his work, which seemed to involve carefully adjusting the carved patterns on a box that was nearly complete. We're providing people with exactly what they asked for, even when they don't remember asking. The boxes contain possibilities, opportunities to understand aspects of existence that most people never get to explore. And the cost is exactly what each customer is prepared to pay, no more and no less. The system is remarkably fair in that regard. As the day wore on, I began to notice patterns in the customers who arrived. They all shared certain characteristics, a particular kind of restless curiosity, a willingness to follow unlikely leads, a tendency to make impulsive decisions based on incomplete information. They were people who, under different circumstances, might have become researchers or investigators or journalists, individuals drawn to mysteries and unanswered questions. Each transaction felt more natural than the last, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the work. There was something deeply satisfying about matching the right box to the right customer, about facilitating these strange exchanges that seemed to serve purposes I was only beginning to glimpse. The wooden box that had started this entire process remained with me throughout the day, sometimes warm, sometimes cool, always present in ways that went beyond its physical weight. I had stopped trying to open it again, understanding somehow that its contents would reveal themselves when the time was right, when I had developed sufficient understanding of my new role to properly interpret what it contained. As evening approached, I realized that I had completely forgotten about my previous life, my job, my apartment, all the mundane concerns that had filled my time before receiving that first mysterious message. They seemed distant now, like memories from someone else's existence, relevant only as background information that had prepared me for this more important work. The elderly man began preparing to leave as the last customer of the day departed with their carefully selected box. "You'll close up tonight," he said, hanging up his apron with the deliberate care of someone completing a significant ritual. "The instructions are all written down, though I suspect you won't need to refer to them very often." "Where are you going?" I asked, though part of me already understood. "Forward," he replied simply. "The same direction we're all moving, just at a different pace now that my particular part of the process has been completed." He handed me a set of keys that felt familiar in my palm, as if I had carried them for years. "The night shift customers will start arriving around midnight. They require different inventory, different approaches, but the fundamental principles remain the same." After he left, I spent the evening exploring the store more thoroughly, discovering additional rooms and levels that seemed to unfold based on my growing understanding of what I was now part of. The building appeared to be much larger on the inside than its modest exterior suggested, with spaces that served functions I was only beginning to comprehend. In what appeared to be a record-keeping area, I found ledgers stretching back decades, documenting thousands of transactions, each one carefully recorded with details about the customer, the box provided, and the eventual outcome of the exchange. The outcomes varied widely, but all seemed to involve some form of transformation or revelation, some shift in the customer's understanding of their place in a larger pattern. The rain outside had grown stronger as darkness fell, creating a steady rhythm against the windows that seemed to synchronize with the subtle sounds the wooden boxes made as they settled on their shelves. I found the sound deeply comforting, like a lullaby designed to ease the transition between one way of being and another. When the first night customer arrived, precisely at the stroke of midnight, I was ready. She was younger than the daytime customers, maybe in her early 20s, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. When she entered the store, she moved with the cautious grace of someone who had learned to expect the unexpected, her gaze taking in every detail of the dimly lit interior with practiced assessment. "I received a message about an order," she said, her voice carrying the slight hoarseness that comes from staying awake too long. "Though I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what I'm supposed to be collecting." I found myself nodding with understanding that felt both new and ancient. Night orders are often more complex than daytime transactions. The requests tend to come from deeper places, parts of the mind that only surface when consciousness has been worn thin by exhaustion or circumstance. She studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" The question caught me off guard, though I couldn't say why. When I looked at her more carefully, I did sense something familiar about her features, a resemblance that went beyond the general similarity that seemed to exist between all the customers who found their way to this place. "Perhaps," I said, reaching under the counter where my hand found a box that felt different from any I had handled during the day. This one was lighter, made from what appeared to be a pale wood that seemed to glow with its own subtle luminescence. The carved patterns were more delicate than the others, forming spirals and curves that reminded me of flowing water or wind-blown sand. "The night inventory operates according to different principles," I explained as I placed the box on the counter. "The contents are more fluid, more responsive to the customer's immediate needs and circumstances." She approached the counter slowly, her eyes never leaving the glowing box. "What's the cost?" I consulted a price list that I somehow knew would be in the drawer beside the register, though I couldn't remember seeing it there before. The numbers seemed to shift and change as I looked at them, finally settling on an amount that felt correct in ways I couldn't explain. $41.19, I said, "though payment can be made in various forms during night hours. Currency, memories, promises, or combinations thereof." Her hand went to her wallet with the same automatic gesture I had observed in all the customers, but when she opened it, I could see that she carried far less cash than the amount required. Instead of disappointment, however, her expression showed a kind of relieved recognition, as if she had been expecting this complication. "What other forms of payment do you accept?" she asked. I found myself consulting knowledge I didn't remember acquiring, understanding flowing through me like water through a familiar channel. Memories of significant moments, particularly those involving choices that shaped your current path. The weight is calculated based on emotional intensity and personal relevance. She considered this for several moments, her fingers tracing patterns on the counter that matched the carvings on the glowing box. I have a memory of the night I decided to leave college. I was walking across campus at 3 in the morning, and I realized that everything I was doing felt like someone else's life. The relief of that recognition, the terror of not knowing what came next, the absolute certainty that I had to choose something different, even though I had no idea what that something might be. As she spoke, I felt the memory taking on weight and substance, becoming something tangible that could be measured and valued. The process was unlike anything I had experienced during the day shift, more intimate and complex than simple monetary exchange. That memory has sufficient value to cover the difference, I confirmed, though I wasn't sure how I knew this. Are you prepared to complete the transaction? She nodded, and I watched as her expression grew distant, as if she was reaching into herself to extract something precious and irreplaceable. The air around the counter seemed to shimmer slightly, and I had the distinct impression that something invisible was changing hands, flowing from her to the store's vast inventory of intangible assets. The transaction completed with the same soft click I had heard when my own wooden box had opened, though in this case, the sound seemed to come from the glowing box itself rather than any physical mechanism. She picked it up with reverent care, and I noticed that her fingertips left faint traces of light on its surface, as if the box was responding to her touch. The same warnings apply, I told her, though the words felt different than they had during the day. Don't open it until you're ready to accept what's inside. But with night inventory, readiness is often determined by circumstance rather than conscious decision. She paused at the door, looking back at me with an expression that seemed to carry decades of accumulated wisdom despite her apparent youth. Will I see you again? That depends on what you find in the box, I replied, understanding the truth of this statement even as I spoke it. Some customers become regular visitors. Others find what they're looking for immediately and never need to return. A few discover that they've become part of the process itself. After she left, I spent several hours exploring more of the store's hidden dimensions, discovering areas that seemed to exist only during the night shift. These spaces were different from the daytime workshops and storage rooms, more fluid and changeable, as if they were shaped by the dreams and subconscious desires of sleeping customers rather than conscious design. In one of these shifting spaces, I found what appeared to be a communications center, filled with equipment that looked like a hybrid between vintage telephone switchboards and modern computer terminals. The screens displayed a constant stream of messages, all variations of the same basic format I had received. Order confirmations, pickup instructions, payment requirements. But as I watched the messages flow past, I began to notice patterns that suggested a much larger operation than I had initially imagined. The timestamps showed orders being processed simultaneously across multiple time zones, in languages I couldn't identify, using currency systems that didn't correspond to any earthly economy I knew of. The business operates on a global scale, a voice said behind me, and I turned to see the elderly man who had been training me. But his appearance had changed again, becoming more translucent, as if he was gradually fading from this particular layer of reality. I thought you had left, I said. I have, in most senses that matter, but the transition process allows for brief returns when new employees need additional guidance. The night shift can be particularly challenging for those who haven't yet developed the necessary perspective. He gestured toward the flowing messages on the screens. Every person who has ever wondered what their life might have been like if they had made different choices, every individual who has felt the pull of possibilities they couldn't quite define, every soul who has stared into the darkness and wished for answers to questions they couldn't articulate. They all generate requests, whether they realize it or not. And we fulfill those requests. We facilitate the fulfillment. The actual work is done by forces and processes far beyond our understanding. We simply serve as the interface between human desire and cosmic possibility. More night customers began arriving as the hours passed, each one bringing their own unique combination of cash, memories, promises, and other intangible currencies. Some paid with childhood dreams they had outgrown, others with fears they were ready to release, a few with hopes they had been afraid to acknowledge. Each transaction taught me something new about the fluid nature of value and exchange in this nocturnal economy. Unlike the straightforward monetary payments of the day shift, night transactions involved complex negotiations between what customers had to offer and what they were prepared to receive in return. One customer, a man in his 50s who moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain, offered 20 years of accumulated regret about a career choice he had made in his 20s. The weight of this emotional currency was sufficient to purchase a box that hummed with potential energy, its carved surface depicting scenes that seemed to show alternate versions of his life unfolding in different directions. Another customer, a teenage girl who had clearly snuck out of her house to make the journey, paid with the memory of her first heartbreak, trading the sharp clarity of that pain for a box that felt warm to the touch and seemed to whisper reassurances in languages that predated human speech. Between customers, I continued exploring the store's night configuration, discovering areas that existed in states of constant flux, rooms that changed their contents based on what each visitor needed to see, corridors that led to different destinations depending on who was walking through them. In one of these shifting spaces, I encountered other employees from different shifts and time periods. They appeared as translucent figures, like echoes of conversations happening in adjacent realities. But we could communicate across whatever barriers separated our respective layers of existence. From them, I learned that the store operated according to principles that transcended normal concepts of time and space. There were day shift workers serving customers in what they experienced as 1987, night shift employees facilitating transactions that wouldn't technically occur until 2045, weekend staff operating in temporal loops that allowed them to serve the same customers repeatedly until the perfect exchange was achieved. The work finds its own rhythm, explained a woman whose apron bore stains from substances that didn't seem to exist in my version of reality. You stop thinking in terms of linear progression and start understanding the patterns that connect all the different moments and possibilities. As dawn approached, I felt the store beginning to shift back toward its daytime configuration. The fluid spaces solidified into more conventional rooms. The glowing inventory settled into mundane wooden boxes, and the equipment in the communications center transformed back into simple cash registers and filing cabinets. The elderly man appeared one final time, now so translucent that I could barely make out his features. "Your first night shift is complete," he said, his voice carrying the sound of distant wind through trees. "You're beginning to understand the scope of what you've become part of." "Will I see you again?" I asked, echoing the question the young woman had posed to me earlier. "In different forms, at different times, when the work requires it. The business has ways of ensuring that necessary knowledge is preserved and transmitted, regardless of the particular individuals involved in any given transaction." He faded completely as the first rays of sunlight began filtering through the windows, leaving me alone with the transformed store and the growing understanding that my role here was far more complex and significant than I had initially realized. I spent the morning hours organizing the inventory, noting how the night's transactions had created space for new boxes to appear on the shelves. The process seemed to be self-regulating, maintaining a perfect balance between supply and demand that operated according to laws I was only beginning to glimpse. When the first daytime customer arrived, I greeted them with the same patient smile I had learned from my predecessor, ready to facilitate whatever exchange they needed, carrying within me the accumulated wisdom of a single night's work and the growing certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The rain continued to fall outside, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the subtle sounds the wooden boxes made as they settled into their new configurations, waiting for the next group of customers who would arrive carrying their own mysterious messages and exact change. The afternoon shift brought a different energy to the store, one that hummed with quiet desperation and half-formed longings. The customers who arrived during these middle hours carried themselves with the weight of lives lived in compromise. People who had spent years making practical choices while their deeper selves whispered of roads not taken. I had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded each arrival. The way the wooden boxes on certain shelves would grow slightly warmer, the almost imperceptible shift in the air pressure that suggested reality was bending to accommodate another transaction. The store itself seemed to anticipate these moments, preparing itself like a theater before the curtain rises. Mrs. Chen arrived at precisely 2:15, her sensible shoes clicking against the worn floorboards with the measured pace of someone who had walked the same routine for decades. She wore the uniform of middle management, a navy blazer that had seen better years, and carried the faint scent of coffee and resignation. Her eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 30 years in meetings that could have been emails. "I received a message," she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of someone speaking words they weren't entirely sure they believed. "About an item I supposedly ordered. Though I have to say, I don't recall making any such request." I nodded with the understanding that had become second nature. Memory works differently when it comes to the things we truly need. Sometimes our deeper selves make arrangements that our conscious minds aren't ready to acknowledge. She glanced around the store with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating cost-benefit ratios and risk assessments. "What sort of business is this exactly? Your storefront has no sign, no posted hours, no visible business license. We specialize in fulfilling requests that fall outside conventional commercial categories," I replied, my hand already moving toward the section of counter where I somehow knew her box would be waiting. Items that address needs rather than wants, possibilities rather than products. The box that emerged from beneath the counter was different from any I had handled before. Its wood was a rich mahogany that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the carved patterns formed geometric designs that suggested architectural blueprints or mathematical equations. When I set it down, it made no sound at all, as if it existed in a pocket of absolute silence. Mrs. Chen stared at the box with an expression that shifted between recognition and confusion. "How much?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer would be significant. $78.46, I said, consulting the knowledge that flowed through me like water through familiar channels. "Plus one decision that you've been postponing for approximately 7 years. Her sharp intake of breath confirmed that I had identified the correct additional payment. "How could you possibly know about that?" "The boxes respond to the specific circumstances that bring each customer to us. They're designed to address the intersection between what someone has and what they're prepared to sacrifice for change." She opened her purse with movements that seemed almost ritualistic, counting out the exact monetary amount with bills that looked as if they had been waiting for this specific purpose. The decision she owed was more complex, requiring her to reach into the space between what she had always done and what she had always wondered about doing. "The decision involves leaving," she said slowly, as if speaking the words aloud gave them more weight than they had possessed in her thoughts. "Not just my job, but everything I've built around the assumption that security matters more than satisfaction. The decision to trust that there might be something better waiting, even if I can't see what that something might be." As she spoke, I felt the weight of that postponed choice settling onto the counter between us, becoming as tangible and valuable as the cash she had already provided. The air around the dark wooden box seemed to shimmer slightly, as if responding to the completion of the transaction. "The same warnings apply," I told her, though with afternoon customers the cautions carried different implications. "Don't open it until you're ready to act on what's inside." Afternoon inventory tends to contain practical guidance rather than abstract possibilities. She lifted the box with both hands, cradling it like something precious and fragile. "Will it hurt?" "The change, I mean." "Change always involves some form of loss," I replied, understanding the truth of this even as I spoke it. "But the alternatives often involve much greater pain, spread out over much longer periods of time." After she left, I found myself drawn to explore more of the store's afternoon configuration. During these middle hours, the building revealed spaces dedicated to what appeared to be customer follow-up services. Rooms filled with filing cabinets that contained detailed records of previous transactions, tracking systems that monitored the long-term outcomes of various exchanges. In one of these rooms, I discovered a wall covered with photographs, similar to the ones I had seen in the workshop areas, but focused specifically on customers rather than employees. The images showed people at different stages of their post-transaction lives, documenting the changes that had resulted from their visits to the store. Mrs. Chen appeared in several photographs, though they seemed to have been taken in different time periods. In the earliest image, she wore the same navy blazer I had just seen, but her expression was more confident, more purposeful. Subsequent photos showed her in different settings, different clothes, surrounded by different people, but always with that same sense of purposeful confidence growing stronger. "The afternoon customers often require more extensive follow-up," a voice said behind me, and I turned to see a woman wearing an apron similar to mine but made from a fabric that seemed to shift colors depending on the angle of view. Their transactions tend to have more complex ramifications, longer chains of cause and effect. "Are you from a different shift?" I asked, noting that she seemed more solid than the translucent figures I had encountered during the night hours. "Different temporal stream," she corrected. "I work the same afternoon hours you do, but in a version of reality where the store has been operating for several decades longer. We sometimes intersect when the dimensional barriers are thin." She gestured toward the photographs on the wall. These customers chose transformation over security, growth over comfort. The boxes they received contained practical tools for rebuilding their lives according to different principles. But practical doesn't mean easy. I studied the images more carefully, noting the subtle details that suggested each person's journey had involved significant challenges alongside the obvious improvements. Do they ever regret their choices? Regret is too simple a word for what they experience. They go through periods of doubt, certainly. Moments when the familiar discomfort of their old lives seems preferable to the uncertainty of their new ones. But regret implies they would choose differently if given the chance, and that's rarely the case. More customers arrived as the afternoon wore on, each one carrying their own carefully balanced combination of monetary payment and deferred decisions. A construction worker traded the security of a union job plus $43 for a box that hummed with creative energy. A retired teacher offered $67 and the fear of being judged for her unconventional ideas in exchange for something that felt warm and encouraging. Each transaction taught me more about the delicate mathematics of transformation, the precise calculations required to ensure that customers received exactly what they were prepared to handle. Too little change, and they would remain trapped in circumstances that no longer served them. Too much change too quickly, and they would be overwhelmed by possibilities they weren't ready to navigate. Between customers, I continued exploring the afternoon configuration of the store, discovering areas that seemed designed for longer-term planning and strategic thinking. Unlike the fluid, dreamlike spaces of the night shift or the immediate, practical areas of the day shift, these rooms had the feel of libraries or research facilities, places where information was carefully organized and analyzed. In what appeared to be a planning center, I found charts and graphs tracking patterns of customer behavior across multiple time periods. The data showed seasonal variations in the types of requests the store received, demographic patterns in payment preferences, and geographic clusters of transformation activity. The business operates according to larger cycles than most people realize, explained another employee, this one wearing an apron that seemed to be made from woven light. Individual transactions are important, but they're part of much broader patterns of social and spiritual evolution. Evolution toward what? I asked. Greater alignment between what people do and who they actually are. The store serves as a catalyst for authenticity, helping individuals move past the compromises they've made for the sake of fitting into systems that were never designed to support their full potential. As evening approached, I felt the store beginning its transition toward the night configuration. The research-oriented spaces of the afternoon shift gradually dissolved, replaced by the more fluid, emotionally responsive areas that served the nocturnal customers. The practical wooden boxes on the shelves transformed into the glowing, ethereal containers that night visitors required. But before the transition completed itself, one final afternoon, customer arrived. She was younger than the others, maybe in her late 20s, but she carried herself with the premature weariness of someone who had already made too many compromises for the sake of other people's expectations. "I'm not sure why I'm here," she said, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who had been going through the motions of living without really participating in the process. I got this message, and something about it felt important, but I can't explain what or why. I studied her face, noting the particular combination of intelligence and resignation that characterized so many afternoon customers. Sometimes the most important decisions are the ones we make without fully understanding their implications. The part of us that knows what we need operates faster than the part that analyzes and questions. The box that appeared for her was unlike any I had handled during my time at the store. It seemed to be made from a wood that changed color depending on how the light struck it, shifting from deep burgundy to golden amber to rich chocolate brown. The carved patterns were so intricate they seemed to move when viewed peripherally, forming designs that suggested musical notation or perhaps choreographic instructions. "The cost for this particular item is unusual," I found myself saying, consulting knowledge that felt both new and ancient. $34.59, plus the promise to stop pretending that safety is more important than truth. She stared at the shifting box with an expression that suggested she was seeing something I couldn't perceive. "Yeah, that's a big promise. How do I know I'll be able to keep it?" "You don't," I replied. "That's what makes it valuable. Promises without uncertainty are just descriptions of things you were going to do anyway. She counted out the money with hands that shook slightly, then stood silent for several minutes, as if gathering courage for the second part of the payment. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been since entering the store. "I promise to stop pretending that safety is more important than truth," she said, and I felt the weight of that commitment settling into the space between us like a physical presence. Even when truth leads to conflict, even when truth costs more than I think I can afford, even when truth makes me responsible for changes I'm not sure I'm ready to handle. The color-shifting box seemed to pulse with its own internal light as the transaction completed. When she picked it up, I noticed that her reflection in the store's windows looked different, more solid somehow, as if the promise had already begun to restore something essential that had been fading. "One more thing," I said as she prepared to leave. "The contents of your box will reveal themselves gradually in response to situations that test your commitment to the promise you just made. Don't try to force the process, but don't ignore the opportunities when they arise." She nodded with understanding that seemed to go deeper than my words should have carried. "Will I know when it's time?" "You'll know," I assured her. "The promise will create its own momentum, its own opportunities for fulfillment. Your job is simply to recognize those moments and choose courage over comfort when they arrive." After she left, I stood alone in the store as it completed its transformation into the night configuration. The afternoon's practical energy dissolved into something more mysterious and fluid, and I found myself preparing for another cycle of nocturnal transactions with customers who would bring their dreams and fears and half-remembered longings. As the final customer disappeared into the night and the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, I found myself understanding that this story, like all the stories that matter, has no true ending. The store continues to operate across all shifts and time periods, serving customers who arrive carrying their own mysterious messages and exact change. Each transaction creates ripples that extend far beyond the moment of exchange, touching lives and possibilities in ways that may not be visible for years or even decades. Tonight's collection reminds us that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single text message received at 3:47 in the morning, or a decision to follow curiosity despite every rational instinct suggesting otherwise. The boundaries between customer and employee, between seeker and finder, between question and answer, are far more fluid than we usually allow ourselves to believe. Rest well tonight, knowing that somewhere in the spaces between sleeping and waking, the work continues. And perhaps, if you listen carefully to the rain, you might hear the soft sound of wooden boxes settling into new configurations, waiting for tomorrow's customers who will arrive carrying exactly what they need to pay for exactly what they're ready to receive. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me for another evening of stories that blur the lines between the possible and the inevitable.